Breaking news from Europe. NATO has announced strikes deep into Russia in the near future. And Polish President Nawrocki announced that the country is preparing to develop its own nuclear weapons. And this is far from the first signal about nuclear weapons. And I think Vladimir Putin doesn't even suspect what kind of Pandora's box he has opened. Because earlier Turkey announced that it is preparing to acquire nuclear weapons. And German Chancellor Friedrich Merz admitted that he is negotiating with Macron for France to share its own nuclear weapons with the Germans. Even the Baltic countries have stated that they are ready to join the nuclear program. At the same time, NATO has directly warned that if Moscow stages a military provocation against any NATO country, the alliance is already prepared to respond, to deliver a salvo of missiles deep into Russia. Meanwhile, intelligence has reported that Russia is building up its military and nuclear forces in the Arctic and constructing new military facilities along the border with Finland. This is reminiscent of the Cold War era and requires increased attention from NATO allies. That's why the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, called on Europeans and Americans to urgently expel unwashed Russians from their countries, especially children and educators. Relatives of Russian officials who so actively hate the West, but for some reason live there, own property, get an education, and even do business, yet continue to actively hate the entire West. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So NATO will strike deep into Russian territory if Moscow decides to attack the Baltic countries. This was stated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, Markus Chakna. And further, his quote, "We will bring the war to Russia. We know exactly what to do." At the moment, the countries of the region are allocating 5% of their gross domestic product to national defense to prepare for a possible attack from the east, and they are already capable of repelling Russia. At the same time, the head of the Estonian Foreign Ministry noted that previous NATO defense plans allowed for the possibility that the Russian army could occupy the Baltic countries before being defeated in a war with the alliance. However, Estonia was never satisfied with this. And here is another quote, "We cannot allow Russia to enter the Baltic countries and only then fight back." Now the alliance has new defense plans which are aimed at moving the main combat operations onto Russian territory. This is a perfect, truly strategic move. Previously, the idea was that NATO representatives permitted the occupation of the Baltic states while NATO mobilized its forces, with fighting then occurring on Baltic territory. The Russians were supposed to be pushed back. Now the strategy has been revised and they've decided that there's no point in letting the Russians into Europe at all. Instead, from the very first stages, they can just start bombing the countries and Russia itself, moving the fighting there and pushing back against Russia on its own territory. Before this, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte warned that the response to a possible Russian operation to seize the Suwalki corridor, which separates the Baltic states from the rest of the alliance members and is a potential target for Moscow, would be devastating. According to him, NATO members and allies regularly conduct exercises involving all intelligence data, which include various combat scenarios. In addition, at the end of January, let me remind you, Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda called on Poland to join the project for the total militarization of the Suwalki corridor. He was talking about a military training ground being built in the city of Kopčamiste at the junction of the borders of Lithuania, Belarus and Poland, where brigade exercises involving thousands and thousands of soldiers will be held, including the Lithuanian National Division and NATO allied forces. Well, the idea is to have a permanent military presence there. But besides Kazakhstan and conventional weapons, Europe suddenly started publicly talking about acquiring nuclear weapons. Polish President Karol Nawrocki believes that his country should start developing nuclear defense considering the threats from Russia. He stated directly that he is a strong supporter of Poland joining the nuclear project and he is not at all concerned about Moscow's opinion on the matter. Nawrocki believes that his country should follow a path that must ensure nuclear deterrence but in compliance with all international norms. Poland, let me remind you, is a participant in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But President Nawrocki is confident and further quotes, "We must move in this direction to start working. We are a country on the brink of armed conflict. It is clear what kind of aggressive imperial attitude the Russian Federation has toward Poland." That's why Nawrocki says he supports strengthening security, including Poland's, even based on nuclear capability. This is an interesting point, and by the way, I already talked about this in one of the previous episodes, but I'll briefly explain this European understanding of the term nuclear capability. On one hand, this can be interpreted as basically acquiring a nuclear arsenal, but the idea here is a bit different, and it has already been mentioned. It's no secret that France, whose president is promoting the idea of creating a common European nuclear shield, has the ability to independently produce nuclear warheads. It's the only country in Europe that is self-sufficient in this regard. So, the proposal from France is as follows. The French transfer nuclear technology to, let's say, Poland. Poland prepares everything absolutely necessary to create a nuclear bomb, but does not actually create it. All the materials essentially are fully prepared so that a nuclear weapon can be created and used in a short time if it becomes necessary. Supposedly, all this will allow them to comply with international law, while at the same time providing a powerful deterrent mechanism against these savage Russians. It's interesting that the Kremlin immediately started crowing that Poland doesn't have the resources to join the nuclear club and that the international community would be against such a decision. But who cares about these Russians? Who even asks them anymore after they've shown their true face in the war against Ukraine? But that's not all. Estonia also doesn't rule out joining the ongoing talks about creating a nuclear deterrence system in Europe. This was stated by Deputy Defense Minister Tuuli Dunaton. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated in Munich the day before that he had started discussions with France about creating a European nuclear defense system. French President Emmanuel Macron plans to soon announce a proposal to extend the French nuclear deterrence system to the rest of Europe. Well, in short, Europe is clearly aiming to expand its nuclear deterrence capabilities, and the reason for that is the aggressive actions of the Russians. For example, Finnish Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen stated that Russia is building up its military and, importantly, nuclear forces in the Arctic and is constructing new military facilities along the border with Finland. This is reminiscent of the Cold War period and requires increased attention. He noted that Russia's key strategic potential in the region is concentrated on the Kola Peninsula, where nuclear weapons, submarines and long-range bombers are stationed. That is why the Arctic remains a critically important area for European defense. That is why Finland has called for increased vigilance of NATO forces in the far north. Today, Finland is participating in the SAFE program, which provides funding for joint defense. Finland may receive about $1 billion, a significant portion of which it plans to allocate for armored vehicles and drones for its ground forces. The Finnish minister also noted that in the short and medium term, European countries still need the United States military presence to ensure security, even though Europe intends to strengthen its own defense capabilities. Here is his quote. In the long term, it would be better for Europeans to have their own strong capabilities, but in the short term and even in the medium term, we need the United States. This is crucial for European security, but besides the classic military threat, there is also another Russian threat that remains in Europe. These are the Russians themselves who hate the West so fiercely, but for some reason use its benefits and even live in the West or send their children there to get an education. And just recently, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, stated that the relatives of Russian officials should be expelled from the United States and Europe. In my opinion, the West should take such measures to further increase the pressure on Moscow. Let me quote Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Pass this message to the Europeans. The Europeans have done a lot. They impose sanctions against Russian nuclear energy, against Rosatom, against people, against their relatives, against their children who live in Europe, who live in the United States, who study at European universities, who own property in the United States of America. So they have a lot of property, they have children and relatives everywhere. Go back to Russia, return home, you don't know how to respect anyone in the United States, you don't respect the rules, you don't respect democracy, you don't respect Ukraine, Europe, and so on. Go back home. Why is this wrong?
This message to Europeans did a lot, but still didn't put sanctions on Russian nuclear energy, on Rosatom, on people, on their relatives, on their children, who live in Europe, who live in the United States, who study at universities in Europe, who have real estate in the United States. They have a lot of real estate. They have children, relatives everywhere. Go the hell back to Russia. Go home. You don't respect anyone in the United States. You don't respect the rules. You don't respect democracy. You don't respect Ukraine, Europe, and so on. Go home. Why isn't that right?
And here I want to quote Volodymyr Zelenskyy again, something he said back in 2022 at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of the savage Russians into Ukraine. Quote, "No matter which Russians we're talking about, send them back to Russia, then they'll understand. Then they'll say, we have nothing to do with this war. The whole nation can't be held responsible." Isn't that right? Maybe it's this very people who chose such a government and for some reason don't fight it, don't argue with it, don't shout at it. Russians should live in their own world until they change their philosophy. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. If you found this episode useful and interesting, you can support the work of this YouTube channel financially with your donation or paid subscription. All links and payment info are in this video's description. Several platforms are listed, so pick whichever is easiest for you. I would be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.